This show is sponsored by Liquid IV. Like many people, I've come into the new year full of hopes and aspirations for the next 12 months. Maybe, like me, you're anxiously pacing the floor waiting for the F1 season to begin, or perhaps you've set yourself a more regular fitness goal, like running your first marathon or commuting to work by bike. Whatever you plan to do in 2025, come into your own way with extraordinary hydration from Liquid IV. Powered by Live Hydroscience, Liquid IV helps you break the mould. Liquid IV is so easy and convenient to tear, pour and enjoy, and it comes in several fantastic flavours, like their new Hydration Multiplier Sugar-Free Raspberry Lemonade, and other winners like White Peach and Rainbow Sherbet. As a regular flyer, I know how easy it is to become dehydrated almost without knowing it when you're travelling. That's why I always take Liquid IV on overseas trips. It's more than just a drink, and it's scientifically formulated to hydrate better than water alone. Just one stick and 16 ounces of water provides 3 times the electrolytes of the leading sports drink, plus 8 essential vitamins and nutrients. And what's more, it's always non-GMO, vegan, gluten-free, dairy-free and soy-free. Embrace your ritual with extraordinary hydration from Liquid IV. Get 20% off your first order of Liquid IV when you go to liquidiv.com and use code THERACE at checkout. That's 20% off your first order when you shop Better Hydration today using promo code THERACE at liquidiv.com.
Ever feel like everything's getting more expensive? Groceries, rent, even breathing. And let's not forget car insurance. It just keeps creeping up. But here's the thing. Insurify makes one part of life easier. It's an insurance comparison site that finds real-time quotes from dozens of top insurers. Insurance companies compete for your business, driving down prices. It's like having a friend who knows all the best deals, but without the smug grin. You could save as much as $1,025 a year, and you might even cut your bill in half. The best part, it's all online. No phone calls, no spam, no nonsense. You could be covered in as little as 10 minutes, and with an excellent star rating on Trustpilot, saving feels less impossible. So why not give it a shot? Visit insurify.com and see how much you can save. That's insurify.com. Average potential savings based on initial quotes received by 183,234 customers seeking insurance through Insurify. Actual savings may vary depending on state of residence, individual circumstances, coverage selections, and insurance provider. Savings results are not guaranteed.
Whistle while you work.
From Disney on March 21st, the magical tale
Snow White.
Snow White.
Snow White.
that started it all
I believe you're looking for me.
arrives in theaters.
Magic mirror on the wall.
Experience the Disney classic
Who's the fairest one of all?
like never before.
We haven't even been in Regost yet.
Disney Snow White, only in theaters March 21st. Rated PG. Parental guidance suggested.
The Athletic.
The race is on, and with testing over and the Australian Grand Prix fast approaching, it's time for us to tackle your questions ahead of the new season. I'm Edd Straw, and joining me with all the answers, from McLaren's status as favourites to Aston Martin struggles, are Scott Mitchell-Malm and Ben Anderson. Well, Ben, we haven't heard from you for a while. You finally moved up due to people's availability.
Oh no, I'm quite cross with you, Ed, to be honest, because you've forgotten about me. We did a live show together, and then it's now like I don't exist in your world. It makes me very sad.
Well, we thought you were getting a little bit too big for your boots, so we thought it'd be a good idea to
I couldn't get any bigger, surely.
Well, the ego is taking over the whole room, and Scott Mitchell-Malm as well.
Speaking of egos.
Exactly.
Hello. I feel, unlike Ben, I've seen too much of you and podcasted too much with you recently, I think. You probably feel the same. I imagine after Bahrain testings, there was a little bit of a hangover where you were like, I could do without seeing you for a bit longer. We've reconvened in the race offices in London for this one, which is unusual. But yeah, how do you feel about seeing me so soon after testing?
It's a little bit disappointing, but it's good to mix it up a little bit, record in different cities, see which is best. We should note down how many different locations we record in a year.
I would imagine about 25. Probably the 24 places we record during the season.
Then plus your own offices.
Yeah.
So you might make 30 at a stretch.
I think there's a decent chance that there are a few races that we have like multiple podcast like locations. If you've got like a preview one that we've done on the Wednesday, maybe there's like an urgent one that we do in the middle of the weekend, and then wherever we've relocated to on like Sunday night. So there might even be somewhere you have like a hat trick of podcast locations. There you go, Ed. There's your homework before the season opener. You've not got anything better to do over the next week or so.
Exactly, Wes. We will.
A lot of time to kill on the flight out to Australia. Why don't you do it then?
I think it would be easy just to record as we go through the year, then get back to everyone at the end of the season with what would I imagine be a very, very dull bit of information. But
no more dull than the intro banter to this podcast.
You've run out of banter, you two. I'm very disappointed. You've used it all up.
It was very banter heavy, Bahrain, wasn't it? Because there were lots of podcasts and there's lots going on.
Yeah, I agree, Ed. I also miss John Noble.
Absolutely. Well, he'll be back soon on a podcast recording, but you have to put up with Ben for now. We've got questions from listeners from the Race Members Club. Many, many excellent questions as usual, making it completely impossible to get through all of them. But we'll have a go at a load here. We'll probably do an exclusive members only recording as well. I'm going to throw a few of them into the first episode of the new season of the Race F1 Tech Show with Gary Anderson, because there were some very good questions for him in there. So hopefully across that we'll get through a decent number. So Ben, you're first up with a question from Cathal O'Brien. Is the championship already McLaren's to lose? Who's going to be consistent enough to challenge them? And Dragon Ninja 85 asks, how dominant are McLaren likely to be this year?
Oh, big question. I'm so honoured to go first as well. We've not been on the podcast for a while, so thanks, Ed.
The idea is you lower expectations for what me and Scott say.
Well, let's try and lower expectations with the answer too. I mean, it's automatically McLaren's to lose because they own the championship, right? So they would go in as favourite. They won it last year narrowly. They did have a great test. From afar, it looked like they had a great test, even though they made a lot of changes to the car, could easily have tripped themselves up. But I think it will be the same contenders. I can't, as messy as the last day looked for Red Bull, the fact that Max was able to get a lap time out of that car, I feel like that's going to come together. You can't underestimate them. And even Max Verstappen in a slightly recalcitrant Red Bull is going to be a contender. So if he can just be in the mix through the early races, and then they develop their way out of whatever trouble they've developed their way into, the whole flexi wing thing, turning on its head from race 8. Is it race 8 that happened? Race 9 it happens. So after race 8, so Barcelona's race 9, that has the power to transform everything, especially with McLaren being so far down that road already, and already whispers that they're doing more clever things with flexing of aerodynamic surfaces even during testing. I think that's too unpredictable. And I think Ferrari were a little bit underwhelming maybe in the test, but I feel like there's a lot more to come from that. If anything, I feel like McLaren were probably showing us a little bit more of their full potential than those other, of those three teams. And Mercedes, I think, probably had the test that flatters them more than the other top 4 teams. So it's going to be, for me, between McLaren, Red Bull and Ferrari, with Mercedes kind of snapping at their heels.
I don't see any evidence at the moment that McLaren will start the year the way Red Bull started last season, because that's dominance. So I would be surprised if that happens. The exception, obviously, is that I say there's no evidence. If you ignored all context and caveats of the Norris long run in day 2, I guess you could argue there's evidence, but there's so much unknown. The fact that it was a single long run that came out at that advantage, or race simulation at that advantage,
on a tyre compound that should have been slower as well. There was one stint where he was using a harder tyre than the others and going quicker. Like, there's too many things about that where you think, okay, it's impressive, but if you just based everything on that, then we might as well all go home now and just give it to McLaren.
Yeah, so I don't think there's any convincing evidence. I should probably say that they're in a Red Bull-esque situation from last year. And if you look at the second half of last season onwards, if you take, I know it doesn't quite work like this, but the first time that McLaren really stepped up and dominated the weekend, the Hungarian Grand Prix, where they were just clearly faster. Which I think if you take the 11 or 12 races, whatever point that was on, for the rest of the year, they only won 5 races. They won less than half the races in the spell of the season where they had a car advantage on average, right?
Yeah.
So that's not to say that therefore McLaren are a useless, wasteful team, or that Lando Norris is useless and wasteful as a driver, as some narratives would have you believe. What my point is that the dominance there came in the real context of there still being other cars that were close enough to cause trouble. My guess would be that McLaren will at best have a similar or slightly larger advantage than they had most of the time in the second half of last year, which I don't think is enough for dominance. So yes, McLaren starts ahead, but not by enough for me to think that, depending on weekend execution, track characteristics, so on and so forth, that any of the other teams might not be able to sneak in on any given weekend. I don't go to Australia thinking this is just a matter of which McLaren wins, but I go there expecting McLaren to start strongest.
Well, there's a word in the question about who's going to be consistent enough to challenge them, and I think for all of them it's going to be about consistency and also the supplementary results. I wouldn't be at all surprised if there's races where all four of those top teams win with ease, just as we had last year. So it's going to be about frequency of those and also your subordinate results. It's going to be so close.
And then on the consistency element specifically, you would have to look then at your lineups, wouldn't you? And you'd think, well, in terms of what you'd predict to be the most consistent lineups would be at Ferrari and McLaren, because they have relatively the most experience and the most stability in terms of running at the front.
There's Scott Mitchell-Malm there attempting to pour water quietly. Look genuinely surprised when pouring water out of a jug. It's not really a jug, it's sort of a cylinder. And then you look so alarmed.
I really thought I might have just about got away with that. I think it's more just like, obviously, like it was always going to probably get picked up on my microphone, but I was hoping that'd be edited out. I was like, no, this is so loud, like there's no hiding this. It's like as an homage to former colleague Mitchell Adam after the Australian Grand Prix many years ago, going into the, because there were a few people that were in the apartment that we were in when we were recording that podcast, going into the bathroom to open a can of beer and then being absolutely shocked that going into the bathroom and not closing the door behind him meant that everybody could hear the world's loudest beer opening in history.
Anyway, Ben, what were you saying?
Well, we're not having beer, unfortunately, on this podcast, but maybe you can sort that out for next time, Ed. I was saying that in terms of the consistency of execution among the top four teams, you would look automatically at Red Bull and Mercedes as being potentially more unreliable, because Lawson is relatively inexperienced in terms of the front-running drivers, and also the Red Bull car has been, recently, historically quite difficult to drive consistently. And obviously Kimi Antonelli being completely new in at Mercedes, even that race stint he did up against Norris and Leclerc day 2 of testing, it was very quick when you calm down the noise in terms of the average, but he did have an off during that race stint as well. So you'd have to expect him to make mistakes even when the Mercedes is in the game. So you look at Ferrari and McLaren as being the most consistent potential challengers at this point.
Another McLaren-related question for you, Scott, from Nathan. How did Piastri compare to Norris during the test? Do you think he can take a step this year and challenge Norris for the title if McLaren is indeed a step above the rest?
He didn't have as eye-catching a run in terms of lap time advantage over other people. That said, the Norris one was obviously a little bit unusual, and Piastri didn't have the like-for-like comparison exactly at the same time in the way that Norris did.
Conditions were worse, weren't they? It was like
exactly
windier and
day
hotter.
to day. The conditions kept changing. You never know exactly which run plan is which, and driving at different times of day as well is always a factor. It's a bit like when you go to Ferrari, for example, and you look at, because I look very, very closely at the data from Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc's best laps from day 2, which, ostensibly are very similar. There's less than a tenth between them. So you automatically go, well, it's close enough to make a comparison, right? They must have been on similar runs because they've done a similar lap time. But they're also just this one single variable at play there is they've also been done at completely different times of the day. And that's the case for Norris and Piastri. The work they do on the same day when the conditions are on paper going to be the most similar, they're one's done in the morning or very early afternoon, the other one's done mid-afternoon into the evening. By extension, you've then got different track conditions and temperatures because you've got evening running versus daytime running. You've got the fact that one day was colder than the other. Wind direction kept changing. Day 2 had quite a lot of drizzle at different points. That kind of stuff. So
and Piastri had no relative point of comparison externally either.
Exactly.
Because the Ferrari and the Red Bull both had problems on that final day.
Exactly.
So it didn't run.
So I just feel like, actually, funnily enough, when we were having a discussion earlier today on the day that we were recording this, and sort of discussing some ideas for the coming days, one thought that popped into my head, unconnected to knowing that we would get this question on the podcast, is I was thinking that Piastri is the driver I actually have the least handle on of whether he had a good test or not, because he had the least amount of comparable data. I actually think But in terms of the second part of it, like about making a step and challenging Norris, I mean, we'll get the first proper answer. That's one of the only times I think through all of our testing coverage and around there where I will use a phrase similar to "we'll find out in qualifying in Melbourne." But that's because Piastri's weakness versus Norris was very much over one lap last season. I felt like he made a decent step on tyre management. I felt that he proved himself brilliantly opportunistic in high stakes situations. I felt that with the exception of that wobble in the high-speed right-hander in Hungary, when he went wide in the end of the middle sector while he was leading and lost a bit of time there, which put him under like a tiny bit more pressure. I don't remember him having any major issues in high-pressure situations. Obviously, the way that he won the Azerbaijan Grand Prix, for example. So I have no doubts, but any of that is purely qualifying pace. So and there is nothing from testing to be able to say with certainty, yeah, he's clearly miles better on this. It's all about what he does in the weekends themselves.
Maybe a little bit on the front tyre use as well. I remember being at Vegas with you, Ed, and that was a particular weakness of the McLaren that showed itself quite acutely in those cold conditions. And Andrea Stella talked about Norris doing quite a lot of work in the final stint, I think especially, of the Las Vegas Grand Prix to get on top of that and improve it. And Piastri didn't make the same step. So I think there's still a few tools in the Norris toolbox that he has over Piastri, which may well just be experience. But I did feel that at the point at which, and I've said this before, Norris had the pressure taken off him by the championship being taken out of his hands, he went up a gear and Piastri didn't quite match that. So he's going to have to if Norris starts at the same level as he finished last season.
Question from Neil Clark that I'll take. Did the conditions leave a lot of unanswered questions? Fairly simple answer to that is yes. Obviously, any test is limited by the conditions, but because it was unusually cool in Bahrain, obviously the final day did get a bit warmer, but it still wasn't classic Bahrain conditions, plus there was wind as well, means that the testing pace doesn't map onto a normal Bahrain weekend. All the teams have an idea of the adjustments. So I think it's just important to remember that while we got a reasonably clear picture by testing standards generally, the Bahrain conditions were a little bit weird. So you just have to bear that in mind. And yeah, there are some unanswered questions. And in fact, there's one in the next question, Ben, that hopefully you can answer a little bit of, from Michael Holden, who says, no doubt teams have learnt a lot over the 3 days, but there's a saying, you don't know what you don't know. Does this apply here? E.g., would Mercedes be confident of their car's performance in hotter temperatures? Would McLaren have concerns about their car's rear on other circuits?
Well, taking the examples as good questions, which they are, I think Mercedes wouldn't be confident of their car's performance in hotter conditions.
Didn't they?
Yeah,
they'd be mad to be confident about it because they didn't prove it and it's a problem.
Yeah. No, exactly. It's a long-known thing. That they're much better at colder temperatures, as we saw in Vegas last year. Like they're an outlier amongst the top teams in terms of that swing. And yes, the last day, particularly the last morning of the Bahrain test was warmer, but it wasn't warm enough to say, oh, right, yeah, the Mercedes works brilliantly in hot conditions. It was windy. The conditions actually were terrible in that final morning, which is probably why Alonso was so grumpy. Well, part of the reason why he was so grumpy after that test. And McLaren, in terms of the rear, well, Stella was saying actually Bahrain is a rear limited circuit, and with that wind sensitivity as well prevailing, if you have any kind of rear limitation, it shows up more there than almost anywhere else. So really they'd be looking at that going, well, if we've got a manageable level of rear instability here, most places we go, unless there's some absolutely ridiculous outlying condition, we're going to be fine. And
like Andrea Stella was saying at the end of day 2, you need that kind of rear instability on a circuit like Bahrain. There's a lot of the corners, especially like turn 1, a little bit turn 4, although that's more sort of like medium speed.
Short
turn 8,
apex.
the turn 8 hairpin, turn 10, and again maybe a little bit like turn 13, the penultimate corner. That's sort of like long right that then sort of tightens. Actually, just getting the rear rotated, a lot of that track benefits really nicely from just having a slightly livelier rear end, as long as you can control it.
Yeah, in and out without spiking the rear temps.
Exactly. So I would actually, I felt that the evidence there showed that yes, the drivers can feel it. Yes, it's something that they definitely need to work probably harder than they want to be able to control it, but it is controllable and it is quick. So I would imagine there's a little bit of confidence within the McLaren engineering team or technical team, just sort of thinking, we've just come through quite a big test of this characteristic, especially, as you say, Ben, in a place where it can be exposed to changing wind conditions and whatnot, and they'll go, we can probably tune this quite nicely other tracks we go.
But in general terms, there'll always be that situation where if a team's not really having the best time, they can use it as, it's only testing, it's only one track, it's only one type of conditions that aren't representative, as an excuse or as a way to deflect from those. And teams that are confident can intrinsically feel like, yes, we're in a good position because we had a good test, but they will also have the nagging doubt of exactly the same conditions apply, that you can't necessarily extrapolate everything, but it does give you some indication.
Well, there's a lot in the question, you don't know what you don't know, and I think probably, that always applies to testing, but I would say given how close everything's expected to be this year, there are going to be things that are weaknesses that in a normal year wouldn't be so noticeable as weaknesses, because a small swing is going to be significant. So yeah, that's very much the case. Scott, a question from Roger Harvey. Who was sandbagging the most? I noticed that both McLaren drivers managed blistering second sector times faster than all the rest, but failed in the final sector. All day 2 and 3 top times seem to be on high engine mode / low fuel. Yeah,
the sandbagging. I don't think anybody was sandbagging.
Hulkenberg was, because he told Ed.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, I was going to make a joke about like, I really hope that for their sake that Sauber were sandbagging, but I don't think that was quite the case. I wanted to just very quickly. The reason I'm just looking at my laptop here, Ed, is I did want to just dive into the to the live timing from testing, just to not to necessarily challenge Roger's claim about the blistering second sector times, but I don't think that was quite as apparent as people thought it was. Like Piastri in the middle sector, for example, was very fractionally slower than his best sector 2 time, was very fractionally slower than Russell's. It was more with Norris, I think, on day 2.
On day 2, he was doing performance runs. He kept bailing on the lap.
But he also wasn't going to go miles faster. Like that. I mean, someone, I'm not going to name names, but someone did ask Stella that in his media session on day 2, and they had slightly over-egged the sort of speed of the Norris lap at that point. It wasn't like he was half a second. Do you remember, like, there was 2 years in a row at pre-season testing at Barcelona where Sebastian Vettel in the Ferrari very notably came off the throttle exiting the final corner, and those were proper, he has gone fastest in both sectors and this is going to smash the fastest so far. That was obvious. That was genuine hiding of proper pace.
Well, Max Verstappen did an emergency stop didn't he, on that same straight?
Yeah, he did. So that's happened before. Yeah, so, I mean, like, look, with McLaren, like, I did think it was a bit convenient that they made mistakes at the final corner, like both drivers did, and didn't complete the lap. But when Norris was doing it, if you that one on day 3, all 3 of the Norris ones, the laps were being aborted anyway. So I got the impression, actually, he kind of just did it. I'm just going to see how fast I can go through the final corner because I know I'm not completing the lap. Because they were coming back in at the end of it, attacking the pit lane, coming in, doing a live stop and then going again. So I think what McLaren were doing they were doing their short run, their low fuel runs, because you do the whole lap. By aborting coming into the pits, you even do the final corner. So you do your whole push lap, you get a full-on attack of the pit entry, you do your live pits that you go away. It's the most efficient way because you're combining a performance run that gives you all the data you need, even if there's not a lap time on the leaderboard at the end of it, and you get your in-lap, your pit stop practice, your out-lap done as well, and then you get to go and do another push lap. So you're doing your cool-down lap becomes your out-lap and everything. You're not losing any time or mileage or anything like that. So I think it was convenient that they didn't have to set a lap time, but they know because they've done the sectors. Like, so you can't pretend like you haven't done those sectors. It's all being timed. It's all being broadcast. So it's kind of like, it's not even hiding in plain sight. It's just, well, this is where we're going to do it. And it doesn't actually matter if we don't get like the ultimate lap time out of it because that's not what they're there for.
But historically, if a team's got confidence, they've got some kind of baked in advantage, they can afford to be sillier at testing or run heavier or detune the engine. And you would feel like from watching that test, McLaren were most likely to be among the teams doing that, because if you've got problems that you're trying to explore, and certainly if you're a team further down and you're not sure what the car's doing or how performant it is, you kind of have to go a little bit closer to your true potential just to understand how good the car is. So, you guys were there on the ground. If you were to rank the teams in terms of who was hiding the most, how would that ranking look? Who was hiding the most and who was hiding the least?
Well, hiding's a very, very difficult thing to say because
hiding is subjective as well. It's
if you're talking about sandbagging as well, sandbagging should be a consistent global time loss, not kind of you abort laps. That's not really sandbagging, because sandbagging should be a...
Okay.
Yeah,
Well, who looked like they were running the heaviest and who looked like they were running the lightest then?
Well, McLaren certainly didn't look like they were running the heaviest, but they also had the weakest speed trap times, didn't they? As paces rather. So engine modes may have been conservative there, but it's really hard, because you get so many laps. You see the lap time windows they're working in, etc. So it's really, really hard to...
A good example, like I know it's a specific one, but like in the midfield, it was very obvious that Alpine were doing more of their performance running with a bit more fuel on than the Williams.
Yeah.
That's certainly how it looked from Trackside.
And Alex Albon admitted they were running,
Yeah.
when Sainz was in the car, light, because of the
Right.
suspension changes and the tyre changes. They wanted to get a better read on that, and they had to do it on low fuel because they felt that high fuel would mask that.
And the programs are almost like, it's kind of the same as when we talk about like observing car characteristics trackside. The extremities are easier to observe. Haas very clearly were doing a lot of high fuel work because they were doing loads of long running from the start of day one. They were doing long stints and the like. A bit like, okay, they're not going out there with the absolute vapors in the tank when Hamilton on day one, for example, does an on-off stint of about 10 or 12 laps. That's like 4 flying laps into the pits, back out almost immediately, 3 more flying laps. You know that he's clearly got a reasonable amount of fuel in the car, because he's not disappearing into the garage for 20 minutes in between those runs. So, I mean, I think it would be concerning, for example, if Ferrari was running lighter than for Mercedes in the test.
Yeah, I agree.
My gut feeling would be a little bit based on sort of maybe what we've seen in previous years, but also like trends from last season, like how they go about like their Friday running, because teams always have different strategies for which engine modes they use.
McLaren normally are a bit more towards the end of being powerful, aren't they, and lighter.
My gut feeling is the way that they go about things is like your McLarens and your Mercedes kind of approaches are more about like, well, we need to find this information out, so we're going to find it out, and we actually don't really mind like if we show a little bit more.
Yeah,
that would be my gut feeling. With
Mercedes never used to be like that, of course.
With
but
Ferrari showing a little bit less, potentially.
Yeah.
And obviously, like Red Bull day 3 was so patchy in terms of what spec the car was in, how much they were experimenting, what tests and evaluations they were doing, that you definitely wouldn't say they were sorted, but I wouldn't say they were sandbagging.
No. They definitely would have run low power mode, I think, Red Bull, because they just always do.
And they've got a secondary team that can do all of the high power running for them.
Exactly.
Question from Manuel Adolfo Diaz-Villa. Between the 3 front runners, who seems to have the broader window for development? I'm not sure who we're considering the 3 front runners, maybe excluding Mercedes. Broader window for development, it's quite tricky to define. In terms of room for improvement, you'd probably say Red Bull have got the most, and they've obviously struggled to get the car into the right window, so there's gains to be made there. In terms of development, it's really hard to say, because they're dealing in such tiny details now in terms of gains. There's not sort of vast areas of the car you can change things, but it's just about who can get the car characteristics in the right sort of place. So ultimately, I would say probably Red Bull are the one with the biggest step that they could potentially make. Ben, a question from Stuart Coulter. We've touched on this, but talking about the weather being abnormally cold, and given the Mercedes performed at its best in cooler conditions last season, how can they be sure they've cured the ills of 2024 when the car didn't work so well when track temperatures rose? And Walker Gunning says, how much of the Mercedes performance should we put down to the cooler weather? And obviously they think they've improved this, but they've got no way of testing it explicitly. So that's the thing, isn't it? It's how much they trust their tools, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, you wouldn't trust the Mercedes tools at this point, would you? They've let them down so consistently in this ground effect era. I think you really have to wait till we get to the hot races, the ones that they noticeably struggled at last season. I think when we eventually go to Bahrain, April, is it? That's a good test. Miami, where they really fluctuated in their performance, that'll be another big test. Every team will think that they've made their car much better over winter, because they always do. The fact that the test was so unusually cold and people were wearing jackets, I'm sure you guys were. You remember to pack your winter wear. Yeah, your Vegas spec rather than your normal Bahrain daytime.
I just wore what I went to the airport in, which is ridiculous, because I went to the airport at 5 a.m. in Sweden in February.
Yeah, ridiculous. So like everything about that test played to Mercedes' hands, and that's why I don't consider them part of that leading group at this stage, because I feel like if anyone was flattered by that test in a prevailing way, it was Mercedes. So yeah, I think take particularly them with a pinch of salt at this stage.
Scott, question from Ben K. You've mentioned that Lewis Hamilton seems to be more comfortable in the Ferrari compared to his last few Mercedes cars. Is he now able to utilise some of his strengths, like the late braking?
Yeah, so I was actually showing Ben some data about this this morning in the office, because I said earlier, like the comparisons are really dangerous, so you have to just caveat everything. But the closest we have for a Hamilton performance comparison is obviously those day 2 times that were close with Leclerc. But I did also pick a few random ones, because you could compare any 2 laps in testing and draw whatever conclusions you want. The way I went about it was I tried to find like, okay, how can I like reduce the noise as much as possible? So for example, on day 3, if you're looking for single laps, it's always dangerous. But day 3, for example, we know that there was a point in the early evening when Russell was on a race simulation or long run, and Hamilton came out at the start of what was meant to be a race simulation. So we both, and Russell, I think, can't remember how much, but maybe between 5 and 10 laps into the stint, but by the time Hamilton started. So there would have been obviously a reasonable amount of fuel less in the Merc, but broadly speaking, both on largely full tanks. And before Hamilton comes in, there's a run of about 6 or 7 laps that they both do. So, okay, hang on a second. Maybe my most relevant point of comparison of the whole day, Ferrari to Merc, is going to be in these 6 or 7 laps, because they're doing roughly the same run plan. I think they were on the same tyre. They're both high on fuel. And there's a lap from each of them within that run that's a 1,000th of a second apart in time. So you're like, okay, well, if in the grand scheme of testing, this is about as unirrelevant, I'm not going to say relevant, but unirrelevant comparison as you can probably get. And within that, there are exactly the same signs, I would say, as you can see from the Hamilton-Leclerc performance run comparison on day 2. And in that, you do see signs of Hamilton braking a fraction later, but no longer bleeding time mid-corner to exit and then down the following straight. The problem he would have in the Mercedes, you'd often see, this didn't happen all the time, but you'd often see it if he got caught out or the conditions weren't quite right. You would see Hamilton brakes a little later, his minimum speed drops to lower, there's a wobble mid-corner or on the exit. He's a bit later on the throttle, and then the speed trace is just worse off the corner, and he loses all that time he tries to gain on the entry. He loses that and more on the following straight. And it might only be half a tenth here, a tenth there, but it's there. And then over the course of the lap, it's a few tenths. Or it'll be most of the lap is really close because it's working, but it puts him more at peril of a big mistake. China last year in Q1 when he got knocked out is a great example of that. Or Australia last year, where it was the difference between him getting into Q3 and Russell getting into Q3. So you would see stuff like that. There's not really any sign of that in the. Again, if I analysed every single Hamilton lap from testing and looked at the data of all of them,
you mean you haven't?
No, I haven't. I'm happy to say that. Then maybe that's why I'm looking forward to Australia, because I think straight away in the quali sims on Friday we'll start to see like real evidence of this. I would say tentatively there is a bit more evidence of Hamilton driving the way that he likes to drive with a bit more of a pre-2022 effect, where he does, that's what I was showing you, wasn't it, Ben? Like, he does, the minimum speed loss is there mid-corner, but he is by getting it slowed down to that degree, despite braking later, he's still getting the rotation, he's still getting on the throttle, and he picks up earlier. He then gets the run off the corner. He's actually losing less time than Leclerc mid-corner, despite having a lower minimum speed at one stage. So I think it's cautiously, it's like tentatively encouraging on that part, but I'll reserve full judgment until we actually see some data from Melbourne.
It looks to me like he's doing what you'd expect him to do, having changed teams. He's going to drive the way he wants to drive rather than the way the car that he's just left behind was maybe forcing him to drive. And he's always had this thing, Ed, you may have come across this, where he overlaps the throttle at the point of braking. I remember talking to Paddy Lowe like years ago about early hybrid era Mercedes, or even before hybrid era, when they got Hamilton in and they had to develop a software cut on the engine, because he just had this habit going way back even to karting maybe of just not coming off the throttle when he hit the brake and always having basically overlap. And they had to engineer the car to kind of reduce sometimes the impact of that. So that habit's always been there. It seems like maybe the Mercedes has gone away from being him able to utilise that somehow. Mark Hughes has written and talked before about Leclerc overlapping throttle and brake a lot, and it being quite useful in terms of tyre temperature spike management because of how you change the balance or progressively change the balance by having some throttle applied. And both they have talked about their driving styles being similar. I think Leclerc mentioned in one of the press conferences that they're very aligned. That's the bit to me that seems most aligned about how they drive. And it shows in one of the traces that you showed me where they're both doing quite a similar thing with the throttle overlapping.
What's interesting is they do it in a slightly different way, in that like Lewis's tends to be that little bit more that kind of stays there sort of as they go sort of into the corner. Like he's kind of like just gradually coming off the throttle.
He never fully comes off. This is the thing that Ray talks about.
Like there are sort of hints of like turn 10, for example, on their push laps. There is a point where like Lewis fractionally does come off completely. Whereas with Leclerc, for example, you see it's much more obvious. He keeps more of the throttle on, and he then like maintains that level of throttle. I mean, it's different for different kind of corner profiles. The slowest corners, invariably, they will come off almost completely because you can't do it. Yeah. But like medium speed corners, like Leclerc's visibly leaving more throttle on. So they do it in slightly different ways. But similar to what you were mentioning about maybe Hamilton couldn't do that anymore in the Mercedes, I would say that genetically the Ferraris presumably are able to do it because it's how Leclerc drives. Yeah. So either Ferrari have engineered their cars in such a way that it allows Leclerc to drive that way, or it just so happens that one of the reasons Leclerc keeps doing it is because the car doesn't punish it.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, and then Hamilton does do something similar, even if it's slightly different ultimately in the actual technique, or even if it's not being rewarded, it's just not being punished. So it just might be the case that it's a friendlier car to drive, and it can put up with that kind of brake late and be more manipulative style than maybe the Mercedes could, because there was a little bit of evidence of George Russell and Kimi Antonelli struggling with that overlap. Not necessarily on throttle and brake, but just that kind of like when to overlap's the wrong word. Forget I said that. Like the transition from sort of like brake, like throttle to brake and turning. I think that was struggling with that a bit more.
Just a quick reminder before we get back to questions, if you want to join the Race Members Club, we have got a special offer on, 90% off your first month. That includes the chance to ask us questions on this podcast, as well as early access to articles and videos.
How much? 90%?
90% off your first month.
That's a huge amount.
It's an absolute bargain. It's going to run for not a huge amount of time longer, but if you get your membership signed up before the first race and during the weekend, then you'll get an idea of what it's all about.
This episode is brought to you by Peacock. The new Peacock original documentary, Matthew Perry, A Hollywood Tragedy, dives deep into the beloved actor's rise to fame and his tragic death. 5 people, including Perry's personal assistant, 2 medical doctors, and an alleged Hollywood drug dealer known as the Ketamine Queen, were charged with conspiracy to illegally provide Perry with the ketamine. Explore the details of the case in this heartbreaking special, streaming now only on Peacock.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. During tax season, your personal info travels to a lot of places. Between payroll, your tax consultant, and the IRS. If your W-2 gets exposed, that's just the ticket for identity thieves. That's why LifeLock monitors millions of data points every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it guaranteed or your money back. Don't let identity thieves take you for a ride. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
I think you're on mute.
Workday's starting to sound the same.
I think you're on mute.
Find something that sounds better for your career on LinkedIn. With LinkedIn Job Collections, you can browse curated collections by relevant industries and benefits, like flex PTO or hybrid workplaces, so you can find the right job for you. Get started at linkedin.com/jobs. Finding where you fit. LinkedIn knows how.
Right, let's get on to our second batch of questions. Ben, a question from Oliver. Do you get the impression Fernando Alonso wants out after this season if the team hasn't moved forward since last season in terms of performance compared to the rest of the field? Or do you reckon he'll rally around the team even more so in the hope of a seat in the 2026 Newey influenced car?
Well, that's absolutely what he's holding out for, right? I think, to me, Aston looked the most lost of the teams in terms of their development and being able to do anything to the car. From afar, it looked, well, he even said that he felt like the order was going to be basically the same as Abu Dhabi, which for Aston is bad news because that puts them in the bottom 3 or 4 teams straight away. They did nothing in the test. That there was one all right-ish lap from Stroll on day 2 where I thought, there might be some pace in it, but largely uninspiring. Alonso seemed grumpy. I think he's written off 25 and he's all about 26. He can't wait for New to get in there, shake things up. Maybe New can find some things some low-hanging fruit that they can pick this season. But it's all about getting ready for 26. And then for Alonso, that's probably his last shot, isn't it? So he's going to try and go out with a bang.
Yeah, unless something weird happens in the driver market, I don't think there's going to be any better alternatives. Scott, a question from Ian Hanley. With regards to Aston Martin, is there any chance they have been hiding pace? As I've seen reported elsewhere, for instance, they were using higher gears in corners and lower power modes compared to Piastri. I'm wondering / hoping as they didn't appear to go for any fast runs, or are they still just slow?
No, I'm not convinced. There were definitely moments where like the run plans didn't quite like align. So there were obviously going to be points of the day where I think Alonso talked about this on day 3. I think he'd done like a new tyre run basically in the middle of the day.
He had the worst times.
Yeah,
of running,
know that you're not going to get the most accurate point of comparison there. But if I just as an example, if I take day 2 for example, Alonso's best lap versus Piastri's best lap set at almost in exactly the same time of day, unless I'm getting this wrong. And there is no evidence on these 2 lap comparisons, which are a tenth of a second apart, that the Aston Martin is slower on the straights. So if anything, I'm taking from that the McLaren is the car that's actually running with its pace being concealed. Ditto on day 3. Again, different run plans. But if you take the point in the morning where Alex Albon in the Williams is on, a car that the Aston Martin is going to be hopefully a competitor of. And I say hopefully from the Aston Martin point of view after the test, not from Williams. They're running in the morning. I think Albon's on the C3 tyre and Alonso's on the C2 tyre. So Alonso's on the slower tyre. But again, when they're doing similar-ish kind of run plans at that time of the day, which is supposedly around the time where Alonso was having like fresher tyres put on the car, again, there's not any evidence to suggest that Williams is miles faster on the straights at that point. So there are times where I just don't think the Aston Martin can do the lap time. And if it's all a bit of a bluff, and in reference to an earlier question, it's Aston Martin that have been hiding the most pace of anybody, then everybody's in on it. And Alonso is selling it more than, and we know what Alonso's like. He likes to play games sometimes. He's very deliberate with his messaging. But, he pointed out that there's no reason for it to be any different to Abu Dhabi last year. And remember, they ended the season 5th in the championship. They didn't end the season 5th in the pecking order. They were 8th or 9th fastest by the end of the year. And, there were some whispers on the Friday morning, the final morning, that Alonso had already communicated to a couple of people close to him that he wasn't particularly impressed by the car. So, if that word's getting out, it's a very well orchestrated leak of something to set an inaccurate narrative, so that when they get on the track in Australia, actually Aston's mega and they prove everybody wrong.
Sometimes you just have to go on a vibe coming from a team. Okay, I wasn't there, but the vibe I was getting from you guys on the ground and everything around that team was not positive. Like, there just seemed to be this kind of generally downbeat, kind of slumped shoulders is the best way I could describe it, kind of vibe from that team.
It wasn't bouncing, and it wasn't like,
And they'd be shouting about it. If they'd made a breakthrough and that car was much better than last year's, I don't think they'd be shy about it, would they? Because they've been getting lots of heat for having a bad car for quite some time.
We know that the pressure and expectation on that team is higher than it is anywhere in the pit lane. So, internally, because they've got an incredibly ambitious chairman and owner who has sunk a load of money into this project. And there wasn't.
You'd be screaming at him, wouldn't you, if the car was amazing?
And again, even if it's vibes based, 2023, they weren't shouting about how great they were, but they were very, very, very quietly happy with what they were doing, and that's not the case now.
Well, related to that, Bill Armstrong asks, are Aston Martin on a Sauber-esque track to the bottom? I feel like their car is going backwards and it looks like it would be the 8th or 9th best car. Can this really be recovered before 2026, given their record of developments in season? Well, it can be recovered. I mean, we had the 9th in our ranking, but it wasn't a catastrophic 9th. So
a gentleman's 9th.
Even though that means we're kind of thinking you go to Australia and they're going to be out in Q1, I wouldn't be remotely surprised if they're in Q2, or even if you get Alonso sticking it in Q3.
It's got all the hallmarks of Alonso dragging something it doesn't deserve out of it.
Yeah.
Now we can fight.
So it could be a small amount. They had a disrupted test. Obviously, on the last day, Lance Stroll was ill and he was struggling. You could see that. So that there were just a lot of little things disrupting it. So although I don't think it's brilliant for Aston Martin, I don't think it's a catastrophe. And I think they can make progress this year, and they need to make progress. They need to show they understand the car and could get it to respond, because if you produce a car and let's say it's not working quite as they hoped, if the car doesn't work as hoped and the upgrades don't work as hoped, then why should a 2026 rules car produced with all the same people and methodologies and science and knowledge and tools be any different?
Because Newey will tell them what to do.
Well, Newey will be able to breathe on the 2025 car in terms of those processes and things, certainly, but it's going to take a little bit of time. He started on March the 3rd, which is today as we record, but it takes time for things to have an impact. So, yeah, I certainly wouldn't say they're on a Sauber trajectory, but I'm interested to see how they progress. They need to make some progress this year. Ben, a question for you from Stephen Camp. Having been a journalist in the paddock before but missed the opportunity to go trackside, what are the things in person, up close, you're looking for that we can't see from the TV shots? Now, I should say, me and Scott did have a chat about this in a video we filmed for Patreon, which has been posted. Now, that was actually a much longer video, but technical problems. And I think I can be honest about the technical problems. Technical problems that involve me not clearing enough space on the recording device led to it not all being recorded. But we did get through all of the talking about the big picture and what we were looking at. So that's one of the things you get if you're a member of the Race Members Club, things like that. I think it was about 14 minutes, 15 minutes of us chatting about it. People seem to like it. So, Ben, just your quick... What are you looking for trackside that you can't get from a TV angle, for example?
Well, you're so much closer to the cars, for one thing. So it doesn't matter how good the TV pictures are. There's nothing quite like seeing a car going past you through all phases of a corner. You can spot subtle differences in car behaviour. You can see drivers on different lines, whether they're consistently on the same line in the same car or not. You can see how a car responds on that initial pitch under braking, whether it responds on turn-in, whether they have a big wait before they can pick the throttle back up. Because basically what you're trying to do is drive the car on the throttle as much as you can, because the faster you can go, the more downforce you generate. So,
well, the more you're going and the more you're not going is always good in a racing car, isn't it?
Exactly. So all drivers are impatient, and you're just looking to see like how much enforced patience does there have to be in this car before you can get it to do what you want. And then the other thing that you miss from not being there is that paddock vibe. So you can take these impressions. There's nothing more valuable, I don't think, especially in testing, than going trackside, seeing the cars for yourself, and then taking those impressions and starting to question people about, I've seen this. How does this tally with what you're seeing or your impressions? Sometimes of a rival team, sometimes of your own team. Sometimes you can put these impressions to a driver and they give you a good answer. In fact, one of our former Autosport colleagues did this to Lando Norris, didn't he, in the day 2 press conference? And he said, looking trackside, looks like the front goes in nicely, but the rear's a little bit slidey. And Norris picked up on that and basically said, yeah, that's broadly right. And then gave quite a long, as he likes to do, eloquent answer about the limitation of the car. And that would not have been a talking point, but for a trackside observation put to him.
Yeah, I was going to say, actually, a good number of drivers and team personnel are very receptive to questions that you ask based on what you've seen firsthand. There's a good
Ben's at the water pouring now.
Yeah, not that quiet, is it? You thought you were getting away with that as well, didn't you?
I thought I could beat you, but no.
Exactly. Yeah, physics gets
limited by the equipment.
Physics gets the best of us all. A lot of the drivers and team people are actually really there's a lot of good faith involved, and it comes from the experience that you have and building relationships, but also just proving that you get decent goodwill just by having shown the impetus to go trackside and then make astute observations, rather than make it sound like you're trying to just impart how much you know on something. And every now and again you'll have a joker. You had it with Nico Hülkenberg a little bit.
Easy.
Yeah, Fernando's
P3 in qualifying.
Yeah, Fernando's another one where you could definitely tell if you came back from a trackside thing and asked him a specific question that he wasn't happy with, you would get probably a little bit of sassy kind of well, what do you know?
Ask Tom.
Yeah,
that's what he'd tell you.
Or he'd say ask someone else in the team, or he would question who are you or your authority to be able to comment on something trackside. Doesn't do it all the time, Fernando on a good day, when he sees that a question is coming from a place of, a genuine effort to understand, Fernando is among the most eloquent on the grid. So it's not a dig at him, it's just different drivers take it in different ways sometimes. But generally speaking, they are, one, interested to know what you've seen from track, like sincerely interested, and two, perfectly willing to elaborate. One of the things I quite like when I come back from Trackside is every now and again a team boss or a driver, or a team member or a driver, will spot that you're coming back with a Trackside tabard on or something like that. And it won't be any element of ridicule. Like, there will genuinely be an interested exchange of information, because the teams are all after this information as well. In fact, as one team boss who shall not be named said to me at one point during the test, "Why is everybody else so obsessed with rankings, and why are other team bosses asking me why we're not doing this specific type of program?" It's like he was genuinely absolutely baffled, like why other teams cared so much about what other teams were doing. But I think, as we said in a podcast in the test, Ed, or you pointed out, it's just like you can guarantee that team boss's team is also doing a lot of looking at everyone else, because that's just part of the game.
Yeah, so if you sign up for Patreon, you'll be able to find that video in our feed where we talk at length about it. Very, very interesting topic. Question from Andrea Cockrell, I'll take. Should we get hopeful about Williams possibly being the head of the midfield? Yes, get hopeful. We rank them fifth. It's very close with Alpine. Racing Bulls aren't far behind. They are a few tenths behind. That could change come Australia. But if I had to bet on it now, I would say that those final Q3 places will be fought out between Alpine and Williams drivers. And I've just got a sneaking suspicion the Williams might just have the edge. But that's much more a kind of looking at the car. It's not a very scientific position because they're really close. But yeah, Williams look like they're going to be in the right sort of place because they should be fighting at the head of the midfield at this stage.
Life is made up of many gorgeous moments. Cherish them all, big and small, with Blue Nile. Whether it's for yourself or a loved one, Blue Nile's unrivaled selection of expertly crafted fine jewelry and statement pieces help make all your moments sparkle. Blue Nile's experts are on hand to guide you, and their diamond guarantee ensures you get the highest quality at the best price. Celebrate a life well lived in the most radiant way and save up to 30% at BlueNile.com. That's BlueNile.com.
Hi, it's Alexa Wybell from New York Times Cooking. We've got tons of easy weeknight recipes, and I'm going to make two of my favorites for you today. For my 5-ingredient creamy miso pasta, you just take your starchy pasta water, whisk it together with a little bit of miso and butter until it's creamy. Add your noodles and a little bit of cheese. It's like a grown-up box of mac and cheese. An easy weeknight recipe that feels like a restaurant-quality dish. Next up, I'm making my vegetarian mushroom shawarma pitas. This recipe is just built for efficiency. You toss your mushrooms and red onion in your spices, throw them in the oven. By the time they're done, your sauce is ready, you've chopped your cabbage, and you're ready to assemble. It feels crazy that something that tastes this complex and looks this colorful and beautiful is actually really easy to make and takes just 20 minutes of active time. It's just delicious. New York Times Cooking has you covered with easy dishes for busy weeknights. Find these recipes and more at nytcooking.com. It smells so good.
Right, Ben, a question from Michael Morwood. How can Red Bull work on their problems between now and Australia, and how much progress can they potentially make?
Well, it depends on the extent of those problems and what's required to fix them, right? Because there's
hedging your bets.
Well, there's massively long lead times in terms of designing, producing, manufacturing, delivering new parts. So if they
is it a setup thing or is it a parts
precisely
thing?
Yeah, thing. As we know, they were doing Flovis paint experimentation analysis very, very late into the test, even in the final hours, minutes of day 3 with Verstappen in the car, as you would do because he's your lead driver as well. And that's not typical. When you've been at a track for 3 days testing, normally by that point you'd be fairly content and you'd be doing your final race runs, or you'd be utilising the fact that the track's in a more representative state near the end of the test and it's cooler and lights fading to maybe do your performance runs. He did do some performance runs, but it felt like there was way, way too much analysis and experimentation going on to be comfortable. And then the results of that experimentation will take time to feed back through the system. It's not that they fed them back in day 1 and it's like we're already on it. They're doing it right at the end of the test. So the learning process is probably still going on. And as you say, if it requires new aero parts, a new floor, That's going to take some. I mean, Red Bull are traditionally brilliant at turning things around in super quick time, but the freight demand of going to Melbourne as well after the test, you haven't got a lot of room to work with. So
and you've got to design them and put them in the wind tunnel and run them in CFD. It's a time-consuming process.
with all the restrictions on what you're allowed to do and for how long you're allowed to run the tunnel and cost cap and whatnot. And with, as Vasseur said, Fred Vasseur, 5 races in 6 weekends, there's not really a comfortable gap in which you can go, right, this is where we're going to deploy it. So if they're in a crisis mode where it's like, we have to do a whole new floor and this and that and the other and other bits that are sympathetic to that, then it's going to be all hands to the pump, and that's going to be appearing on the car ASAP at some Friday practice to be decided, but certainly not race 1 or 2. If it's just a case of, this was an experimental part, we hope that it worked, but actually it doesn't matter too much if it doesn't, then they'll revert, won't they? They'll have a floor spec and other parts that they are comfortable with, whether it's the nose with the slot gap or not, whether it's closer to last year's end of season car or not, and they'll just run with what they think is the best amalgamation of parts for race 1.
Scott, a question from Jeff O'Boyle, also with a Red Bull theme. Is there anything to indicate that Liam Lawson might be the first driver in years to get into the mix in the second Red Bull? And David Banton asks, based on what we've seen in testing, was Red Bull right to replace Sergio Perez with Lawson? There's also one from Benjamin, asking from Trackside how Lawson looked compared to Verstappen, and did he seem as comfortable throwing the car into corners?
It was very tricky to judge Lawson because obviously he had the car for the whole day on day 2, but they lost a little bit of time due to a water leak, and then he didn't drive on day 3. So and the conditions were so different day to day that a Lawson-Verstappen comparison's utterly futile. And he had a compromised enough program on day 2 that kind of willing to cut him a little bit of slack, to be honest. It'd be a bit too hard to judge him too much. Plus, when you then look at what other teams were doing, like when Lawson was on track in the evening and Norris was as well. Norris didn't complete a proper representative run.
It's a shame Lawson didn't do that race that Leclerc, Antonelli, and Norris did on day 2.
Yeah, exactly. So looking a little bit more kind of, how should I put this? Somewhere between kind of the data and the vibes that Ben was talking about earlier in terms of from the paddock. Because I did ask Lawson a couple of questions on the final day.
He wins on vibes, doesn't he? The whole vibe from Red Bull is hey, we love Lawson. He's got a great attitude.
I think they're very pleased with the way that he's come in and the sort of breath of fresh air within the garage. Because obviously, not to say that Checo was too difficult or anything like that, but I think over the course of last year that was the situation. It was a bit more tense, a bit more strained. A little bit of more like people at odds with each other, and it didn't need to be that way. Whereas it obviously became a bit more of a so it's a clean slate for everybody. So there's definitely that. Performance wise, really hard to judge.
New manager bounce.
Yeah, a little bit. New driver bounce. So the thing I would say is there's nothing alarming in the data in any of the comparisons that are tentatively possible, beyond obviously the limitations that seem to exist within the Red Bull. There were a couple of times where Lawson had snaps mid-corner, and that meant a little bit of lap time bleed and that sort of thing. But he seems quite calm and quite confident, and he even said I feel like I'm going into the season in a good place.
They all do though, Scott. Before they've taken on Verstappen.
Yeah, before they take on Verstappen, sure, but I feel like I definitely don't feel like there's any kind of being on the back foot. And I know that he's in a better place than some of the rookies, the real rookies that haven't missed anything. But if I look at the learning curve that Isaac Hadjar is on, for example, and what therefore Racing Bulls decided to do with his testing program, where they gave him basically his race simulation on day 2, because and in the middle of the afternoon, because their logic was, he needs laps and he needs to find a rhythm with this car. So actually we're going to front load his program with get out there and just drive. And then we'll use his half day on the final day to start doing some performance work and some setup work and evaluation. I spoke to Lauren Mekies in the paddock, and he just said there's no point in us sending him out to check changes and do stuff when he doesn't know, he doesn't have a reference. Lawson's not having to be chucked in any kind of weird situation like that, where then you're coming out of the test and going to Australia
he's done 11 Grand Prix, so you'd expect.
Yeah, but you make that sound like it's a lot.
It's more than Hadjar's done.
No, for sure. But that's my point. Is you have an extremity from an unprepared rookie point of view who's on the back foot. versus someone who is also facing a much tougher challenge than Hajar is going into a season alongside Max Verstappen at Red Bull. So I'm getting the impression that Lawson's not like drowning in the situation that he finds himself in. I still feel like even after a first and compromised test with Red Bull, he's got a little bit of momentum in himself. But it's going to be how that actually translates when everybody is competing for those final tenths of a second, because that's my main question on Lawson. Is I think you're quite a robust driver. I think you're an aggressive driver. I think you've probably got a good mentality, a strong mentality. But if you're lacking a couple of attempts to Verstappen, it's not going to matter.
Ultimately, there was nothing in the test that said they were wrong to replace Perez, and Lawson looked decent on track. So I'd say it's perfectly solid start for him in that regard. A question from Zach Bukowski. How has Jack Doohan been getting on? Is he ready to scrap for the last few points with Carlos Sainz, Alex Albon, Pierre Gasly and maybe Fernando Alonso? He looked fine in testing. I would say he didn't look quite as comfortable with the car as Pierre Gasly did. Gasly looked very at ease with the Alpine, I have to say, but I wouldn't expect him to. So I think Doohan's looking fine. He'll work through quite sensibly, build up some pace. The Alpine should be a Q3 threat. However, I would be slightly surprised if he was the one getting through to Q3 and it wasn't Gasly. And
it's going to be Gasly, Albon and Sainz, isn't it, for those final 3 spots, you would think.
One thing about Doohan, don't forget that
final 2 spots.
On his debut last year in Abu Dhabi, had Alpine not botched the run plan for the final runs, he would have been comfortably in Q2.
Yep.
And he had compared really well with Gasly on the first runs. I think Doohan's a little bit quicker than he gets some credit for.
Quick driver.
And there's 2 things I would say. One is I agree he didn't look quite as hooked up in the car as Gasly did. Maybe you wouldn't expect him to, but there was clearly a little bit more disjointedness in his driving. 2, the impression I get from Gasly is it's proper, like it's Gasly when he's like really, really like comfortable in his team and the car's doing what he wants it to do. I think we might properly see like best of Gasly at the start of this season. He was metronomic on track. I think driver and car combination wise, it was Gasly and the Alpine that stood out most to me. Just purely because like I watched him on long runs and I was like this is identical. Like my brain could be replaying like the image of him coming through turn 10 at the moment, because it's exactly the same lap after lap.
So you feel then that if it's Williams and Alpine basically scrapping for the head of the midfield and the top 8 places in theory are locked by the big 4 in a standard race, it's going to take Williams being slightly off it for Doohan, and Doohan being close to Gasly to kind of nip in and take those points.
I would say it would surprise me if Doohan's immediately there in Q3 backing up Gasly and like blocking out Williams.
Yeah.
But I would be disappointed if he's not like just on the fringes of Q3. I'd expect him to be at the back of that group, but he shouldn't be getting knocked out in Q1 if the car's as decent as it looked in testing.
Don't underestimate Doohan, I would say. I know I've said he's got to go in there and really show he's spectacularly good, but he's a quick driver. He's a hard worker. I think he could probably surprise a few people. But yeah, just based on testing, he wasn't quite as comfortable with the car. Ben, a question from Jacobus van der Looper, usually known as Jacobus VDL, when he sends in questions. Does the Bahrain track give teams enough variation in layout, corner types, temperatures, etc., to give the teams a clear understanding of the behaviours of the cars for other circuits? If not, what corner types and other features does Bahrain not test well?
Well, in short answer, no, it doesn't. It's a bit of an outlier, isn't it? It's a straight line circuit. It's mostly low speed, short duration corners, as Scott was outlining
Big
earlier.
traction test, isn't it?
It's rear limited. The surface is quite rough as well, I think, isn't it? So it's a bit of an outlier in terms of the I don't want to say micro or macro roughness. I'm getting too into Pirelli speak, but it's not, let's say, the most representative track surface either. Corner types missing, where you don't have a huge amount of high speed. You don't have a huge amount of high-speed combined corners. You don't have any real chicanes. You don't have many bumps or chicanes or corners with massive curbs that you need to take and ride.
I was going to say curb riding is something that's missing.
Yeah, there's a few kind of serrated exit curbs and whatnot.
There's a bit of
nothing.
turn 10.
Yeah,
what would fix this is if they use the Bahrain outer circuit, like they switch it each day.
Yeah. Well, they could do, I suppose, couldn't they? I don't know why they don't. But.
Ultimately, it's not quite as pure an aero test as, say, Barcelona.
No, exactly. Yeah, you're not fully leaning on the car in that way, are you?
So. It is the only time of the year I miss Barcelona. Barcelona testing, like especially this year because it was so cold.
Barcelona would have been warmer this year.
But just there are those moments where you're like, that's impressive. Like something stands out. I feel like that's the thing. Something really stands out in a more conventional way at Barcelona than it does in Bahrain. Because also Bahrain is so, because of every point you mentioned there, Ben, it's like, you do Bahrain and you're like, okay, this is a great indicator for this track, and now I look forward to going to the Red Bull Ring in Austria, and then I will get a similar reading for what I've got here. And then all the circuits in between.
But with less wind and less ambient temperature. And
sometimes.
Kind of stuff.
Do you remember that year that it was absolutely roasting in Austria? And was it like Merck got something like wrong? So some finger trouble with the inputs or something like that. Edd?
They didn't have the cooling. They didn't have the cooling capacity because slight error.
In Austria, of all
basically
places.
in the cooling demands when they were speccing out the car. Right, Scott, a challenge for you from 9 to 8 pilots. Not actually directed at you, but I'm directing at you. Could you rank the rookies and include Lawson after what you've seen in testing, independent of their cars, to the extent that's possible?
I can. I would say I'm going to do this
reverse order.
In reverse order. Okay, I'll do this based on how comfortable they looked in the car mixed with like how quick they looked. So if you're just like, you're nice and steady and didn't make any mistakes, but you're also half a second off your teammate, that doesn't count. It's really difficult to separate Gabriel Bortoletto and Isaac Hadjar at the back because...
I'm surprised because from the outside you'd have thought, well, Bortoletto's ahead because he looked better compared to Hulkenberg than Hadjar did compared to Tsunoda.
So I've got Hadjar at the back and Bortoletto ahead. The reason it's hard to judge is because obviously you have stuff when Bortoletto's driving the Sauber where you don't know if that's driver or car because it's driving the worst car. Like in relative terms, the worst car. So that's just difficult. But they're both, the reason they're both at the back more than anything else is because, and we had a brief conversation about this during testing, it's like they're sort of, it's a bit of an inadvertent stitch up really, but they're not just the least prepared of the rookies, they're the least prepared by some margin. They haven't had like days and days of TPC running.
They're in a subgroup of their own,
Three of the 6 drivers in this list have started a Grand Prix, so it's a weird rookie crop for their argument's sake. So Hadjar 6th, Bortoletto 5th. I've got Doohan next, just because I do think there was a little bit of speed lacking. I think he's 2 or 3 tenths off Gasly at the moment, and
it's Pete Gasly, though, isn't it? That's hard to beat. Pete Gasly in a team he's
but then I'm also like, there are some other good teammates on this list. So,
sure.
So there's like a little bit of speed missing and a little bit of comfort missing. So Doohan's in there. Then I would go just purely because I can't put him higher because it's hard to read because of things. So I'll go Lawson in the Red Bull. Car's a bit tricky. He's got one of the hardest references in terms of teammate. The testing program was the weirdest because obviously he was. I'm going to make myself look like an idiot when I say this. I'm pretty sure he's the only rookie that did a whole day in the car and then didn't run at all on another day. So that kind of gradual progression's harder for him to do. So I put him there. Then I've got Antonelli in the Mercedes, who in a non-critical way looks like a driver who has done an absolute shed load of testing and therefore looks very, very assured for a rookie, very quick as well. But he looks like a driver who's done that testing on not the right tyres because there's just like a little bit of like a bit more locking up here and there. And that does look like a Merc weakness as well, so I don't want to punish him too much for that. But it did just look like a very fast but unrefined. And then, the most prepared looks like Ollie Behrman. He looked, and again, I'll use a similar method as Antonelli. Behrman looks like a driver who stepped in last year, raced 3 times and looked damn good when he raced 3 times. So, and also Behrman has done a lot of TPC work. He's done a lot of Friday practice stuff with Haas. He's done tests with Haas. So
FP1's going back to 2023.
Yeah, so he is properly part of that team. He's got everything he needs to start the season on the front foot.
And the final question related to that from Simon Ems. I'll take this one. Should Bortoletto be worried? There's a history of good rookies being swamped by bad cars. Yeah, the Sauber doesn't look great, very stiff, tricky to drive. Bortoletto was probably the most wild driver out there, but I think that was more the car and the rookie driver pushing it to its limits to try and explore it. So I think it's going to be tough for Bortoletto, but he shouldn't be worried if that team just backs him and says to him, look, we know it's a bit tricky. You're up against an experienced teammate. You're going to be in the car next year, whatever happens. give him that confidence and he'll come through it because he's a quality driver and he's intelligent enough to make that work. But it's never nice to come in as a rookie in a tricky car. That's never ideal, but you can show well in it. So I just hope that somebody at Audi just doesn't just decide to try and blame a driver if they have a few races and Bortoletto's struggling a little bit in a difficult car. It's very, very clear the car's the problem here.
That's the bit I was concerned about. It's the politics of it. If it's worse than expected and you've got a particularly political situation with the team ownership, it's an easy scapegoat to blame the inexperienced driver. I feel like with the question being framed as, the driver getting swamped by a bad car, as long as they're comparing well to the teammate and he's got a really good reference in Hülkenberg, he should be okay. If he's getting smashed by Hülkenberg, then that will be a concern, because as good as Hülkenberg is, if Bortoletto's got this amazing potential ceiling, that shouldn't happen, certainly over time. But the one caveat is, if they're just looking for an easy thing to blame to deflect attention away from a lack of investment or misplaced investment or lack of progress at the right rate, then you can just blame the driver and make a change, can't you?
To which I would immediately be responding to Sauber and Audi and just saying, well, maybe then you shouldn't have dragged your heels so much. You only signed this guy last November, weren't confident enough to have a testing of previous cars program running, and then didn't get to the start of this year and realise, hang on a second, there's now a massive restriction on the amount of mileage we can do. So he's only going to get one day in the car at Barcelona or wherever it was before we go testing. It's like you should have probably done a little bit more to, one, get the driver you actually wanted in the car, and two, done a better job of preparing the driver you did ultimately go to sign. They went the reasonable lengths to get hold of Bortoletto as a driver for the future. It would be embarrassing if Audi or Sauber then screwed him over after one season.
They feel so behind their own curve,
yes.
Audi, in almost all respects.
As far as I'm concerned, they've wasted that wonderful run-up they had. And it's very disappointing. A lot of work needs to be done with that team. And, Bortoletto probably will be a little bit worried, but hopefully they'll just say, look, we know it's not you. Work your way through over the next couple of years, and then when we get good, if that happens, then you'll be okay.
One final word just on Bortoletto himself. I must say he did wear the kind of the sort of expectation or excitement of his rookie season very, very well. He's still very much at that point of like, this is great. I'm in F1. I'm confident. I've got the backing of everybody, and I'm actually pretty sure I'm going to be able to show what I can do. I got that. I get that impression from him.
Self-assurance.
And I have to say, he's. I haven't dealt a huge amount with him. I'm looking forward to sort of speaking to him a little bit more this season. I quite like the impression that he gives off.
There was some noise on the television about that as well. Alex Brundle, when he was doing some bits for the Sky broadcast or F1 TV, Sky combined broadcast, he was saying quite some nice positive things about Bortoletto's mentality, the way he came across. He was like the pick of the pure rookies. If you're really comparing him and Hadjar, he said he felt like he was almost stitched up in the sense of being asked the question of who would have won that race if at the season finale in F2 if it had played out normally and hadn't been an incident. He was like, and he couldn't quite answer the question, but he did praise Bortoletto for having a particularly strong mentality or an attitude. So tallies with your impression as well.
But generally, anyone in the Sauber should be worried, I would say. This year, that's going to be a bit of a theme unless they do something spectacular.
Maybe they're the ones hiding the most pace.
Well, they're hiding it very, very well.
I hope so.
If that's the case, that's what I'd say. Well, great set of questions there as always. Sorry we couldn't get through all of them. Thanks very much, Ben and Scott, for those. Remember that 90% off your first month for the Race Members Club.
How
membership,
much? 90%
off. Yeah, it's a great deal. And there's loads of stuff there, including that chat we talked about with me and Scott talking about what we're looking for. Trackside. So thanks, everyone. We're not far off the first race of the season. We'll be heading off to Australia very soon, so stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.
The Athletic.